It began quietly, like most forbidden stories do. She was a teacher, disciplined, respected, the kind of woman who lived by order and principle. He was the opposite, a former biker with a past written in scars and silence, a man who'd once lived fast and fought harder, now trying to rebuild a life far away from the chaos of the road. They met by accident, in a place where two worlds that should never touch somehow collided. And in that collision, something undeniable began to grow. At first, it was small, just conversation, shared glances, the kind of connection that feels harmless until it's not. She saw in him what no one else cared to look for: redemption, patience, a man who had learned his lessons the hardest way possible. He, in turn, saw in her the peace he'd been chasing for years, the kind that no engine roar or open road could ever give him. But love, as they were about to learn, doesn't stay hidden for long. Rumors began quietly, whispered in hallways, exchanged over coffee cups, passed from teacher to parent to student. The biker and the teacher. The words carried a sting, as if love were something dangerous, something that needed to be justified. It didn't matter that he had left that world behind, or that his hands now built homes instead of breaking them. To them, he would always be that man. And she, by loving him, had crossed an invisible line that no one could see, but everyone could judge. As the walls began to close in, the school board called her in for a meeting. The tone was polite, but the message was clear. Her choices were a reflection of the institution. They asked if she truly understood what she was risking: her job, her reputation, her future. She looked them in the eyes and said, "I understand exactly what I'm risking, but I also understand what I've found, and I won't apologize for it." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with disapproval masked as concern. By the time she walked out of that room, everything had changed. Her colleagues avoided her, parents complained, and the students whispered more than they spoke. But when she came home that evening, he was there, waiting on the porch, grease on his hands and worry in his eyes. And when she told him what had happened, he didn't speak. He simply took her hand and said, "Then we'll face it together." In that moment, she realized that love, real love, isn't something you hide to protect. It's something you stand for, no matter the cost. The following days were heavier than she had expected. The whispers didn't stop, they grew. Her students, once warm and open, now watched her with curiosity instead of respect. Parents started sending complaints to the principal, questioning whether someone, like her, should be teaching their children. It wasn't about her work. Her lessons were still as thoughtful and passionate as ever. It was about him. The man with tattoos on his arms. The man who used to ride with the kind of people they crossed the street to avoid. At night, she sat by the window, watching him in the garage. He didn't speak about the rumors, but she could feel the guilt in his silence. His hands, once so sure when fixing an engine, now trembled slightly when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening, he finally said it. "Maybe you'd be better off without me." The words hit her like a blow, but she didn't flinch. She crossed the room, placed her hand on his, and said softly, "You're not my mistake. You're my choice." The way he looked at her then, like a man seeing light for the first time after years in darkness, was all the reassurance she needed. But the world didn't make it easy. A photo surfaced online, a shot of them together, laughing over coffee, his arm wrapped around her. It spread through the town faster than wildfire. By the next morning, the school board had called another meeting. "We can't control what people see," the director said coldly, "but we can control what represents us." The unspoken words hung between them. In this, or lose everything. When she got home that day, she didn't cry. She just sat quietly, staring at the picture that had caused the storm. There was nothing wrong with it. Two people in love, sharing a simple moment. And yet, somehow, that love had become a scandal. He found her sitting there, the phone glowing in her hand, and she looked up at him and whispered, "Why does the world hate what it doesn't understand?" He didn't answer. He just pulled her close and said, "Because it's easier than learning to understand." And so, they made a promise that night, not to run, not to hide, and not to let anyone else define what they meant to each other. If love had chosen them against the odds, then they would protect it, even when the world tried to tear it apart. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but neither of them had ever been afraid of a fight worth facing. Weeks passed, and the storm only grew louder. Anonymous letters arrived at the school, calling her reckless and unfit. Someone even scratched the word shame on her car door. Yet, through it all, she walked into her classroom every morning with her head held high. The students didn't see fear in her eyes. They saw strength. And slowly, a few began to understand. They'd see her smile at their mistakes, stay late to help them study, and treat everyone with the same warmth she always had. To them, she was still the teacher who cared, and that mattered more than the gossip outside. Meanwhile, he faced his own battles. The whispers about him reached the workshop where he worked. Customers canceled appointments, calling him a bad influence. His boss, who had once trusted him, started keeping his distance. He could feel the past creeping up again. The judgment, the looks, the quiet assumption that people like him never really change. But this time, instead of running, he stayed. "If I run now," he told her one night, "then they win. And I'm done running." Their relationship became a quiet rebellion. They didn't shout their love to the world. They simply lived it. He started volunteering at a youth center, helping troubled teens who reminded him of the boy he once was. She continued teaching, even when it felt unbearable. Slowly, people began to see them differently. Not as a scandal, but as two people standing up for something real in a world obsessed with appearances. Still, there were nights when doubt crept in. She would wake in the middle of the night and find him sitting outside, staring into the dark, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked once, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up, the moonlight reflecting in his eyes. "Only that I didn't find you sooner," he said. And for the first time in weeks, she laughed through her tears. They were two souls who had fought the world in different ways. She through patience, he through resilience. And somehow, those two paths had led them here, to each other. Their love wasn't perfect. It was bruised, tested, and scarred. But maybe that's what made it beautiful. Because the strongest love isn't the one that avoids the storm. It's the one that stands tall through it, hand in hand, until the skies finally clear. One morning, everything changed again. She arrived at school to find the principal waiting by her classroom door, holding a letter. His expression was tight, careful, as if he were carrying something fragile but unwanted. "You're being placed on administrative leave," he said quietly, "until the board decides what to do." The words echoed in her mind like thunder. Around her, students peeked from the hallway, confused and frightened. She stood there, frozen, her hands trembling as she took the envelope. The paper inside was brief, impersonal, and cold. It wasn't about her work, her dedication, or her years of service. It was about perception, about image. That evening, she didn't speak for hours. He knew better than to press her. He simply worked beside her in silence, fixing a broken motorcycle under the dim light of the garage. Eventually, she whispered, "They're suspending me." He stopped what he was doing, wiped his hands on a rag, and met her eyes. "Then we start over somewhere new," he said firmly. But she shook her head. "If I run now, they'll think they were right. And they're not." Her voice cracked slightly, but the conviction in her tone was stronger than the tears she tried to hide. Word spread quickly. The story hit local news outlets. A teacher, involved with a man from a controversial past. The comments online were ruthless. Strangers who didn't know her, didn't know him, judged them as if they had the right. Yet, in the middle of all that noise, letters began arriving from former students. "You taught me to stand up for what's right. You told me that everyone deserves a second chance." Those words became her armor. Each letter a reminder that she had spent her life giving others courage. And now, she had to find her own. One afternoon, as she read through another message, he approached her quietly. "You could have walked away," he said softly. "But you stayed." She smiled faintly, her eyes wet. "You spend your life running from judgment," she replied. "Maybe I was meant to teach us both how to stand through it." That simple truth bound them closer than ever before, not out of defiance, but out of shared faith that love, when real, doesn't crumble under pressure. It endures. Together, they decided to fight back, not with anger or hate, but with honesty. She reached out to the local paper and agreed to an interview. "You want to tell a story?" she told the journalist. "Then tell the whole one. Not the rumor. The truth." Her voice didn't shake, and when the article came out a week later, it didn't just tell their story, it changed how people saw them. For the first time, they weren't the scandal. They were the courage that stood behind it. The article spread beyond their small town. People who had never met them sent messages of support. Teachers, Bikers, single parents, everyone who had ever loved someone the world told them they shouldn't, reached out to say, "We understand." Suddenly, their love wasn't a secret to hide, but a symbol for something bigger, something that defied the quiet cruelty of judgment. But even as some hearts softened, others hardened. The school board met again, this time under the pressure of public attention. Some members insisted she had tarnished the school's image. Others argued she had done nothing wrong. The debate dragged on for hours. Finally, one of her former students, now grown, now confident, showed up uninvited to the meeting. "You taught me about compassion," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "If this school can't show her the same, then maybe it's not teaching what really matters." The room went silent. By the end of that night, the decision was made. She was reinstated. Not because the world had changed, but because she had forced it to see her differently. When she walked back into her classroom days later, her students stood and clapped. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It was sincere, raw, and full of respect. She smiled through tears, realizing that victory doesn't always come in applause. It comes in quiet moments of truth. That evening, when she came home, he was waiting outside, sitting on his bike. "How'd it go?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She didn't answer with words. She walked straight to him, kissed him deeply, and whispered, "We won." He laughed, pulling her close, the relief in his chest finally breaking through years of fear and guilt. For the first time, he believed what she had always seen in him, that he wasn't defined by what he'd been, but by what he'd become. And, as the sun set behind them, they rode out together, the wind carrying away the last remnants of judgment. Two souls who had stood against the world, and one, not through rebellion, but through love that refused to apologize for existing. They didn't need to prove anything anymore. They just needed to live freely, honestly, and together. Autumn came with quiet skies and a feeling of peace they hadn't known in months. She taught again with confidence, and though the judgment never fully vanished, it no longer carried the same weight. The students saw her not just as their teacher, but as someone who had lived the very lesson she spoke of: courage, integrity, compassion. In her classroom, she hung a small quote above the board that read, "Love is not a weakness. It's the strength to keep believing when the world tells you not to." Every day she looked at those words and smiled, remembering the road it took to understand them. He too had changed. The once restless biker found peace and stillness. He repaired bikes for a living, but more than that, he fixed broken spirits. Young men from the same streets he once roamed came to his workshop, not for repairs, but for guidance. "You can leave that life," he'd tell them. "You just have to want something worth staying for." They listened because his words weren't theory, they were lived truth. And behind every lesson, there was her, his reason to keep walking the better path. One afternoon, while cleaning his tools, he found her sitting outside, reading under the fading sun. "You ever think we'd make it this far?" he asked. She looked up, her smile soft but sure. "I didn't think about making it far," she said. "I just thought about making it together." That was their difference. They didn't chase perfection. They built endurance. Their love wasn't a fairy tale. It was a promise renewed every day, through storms, silence, and everything in between. But the world still watched them, some waiting for them to fail. What those people didn't understand was that their story wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving to themselves that love, when it's real, doesn't need approval. It just needs truth. So they lived quietly, without seeking validation, letting their happiness speak louder than any rumor ever could. Then, one day, something extraordinary happened. A student's parent, one of the loudest voices who had once demanded her firing, came to the school, eyes full of shame and humility. "I was wrong," she said simply. "You taught my daughter more about kindness than any lesson ever could." It was then the teacher realized she hadn't just survived the storm. She had transformed it into light for others to see. Winter brought with it a stillness that felt different, peaceful, but reflective. They had weathered judgment, fear, and public shame, but what lingered now was grace. Every scar their love carried had become a story, every wound a lesson. Sometimes, when snow fell softly outside their window, they would sit in silence, no words needed between them. He would trace circles on her palm and whisper, "You saved me." She would always reply, "No, we saved each other." Her students began a small project that winter, a community initiative they called Bridges, inspired by her story. It focused on bringing together people from opposite walks of life, retirees and teenagers, police officers and former bikers, teachers and ex-convicts. It was proof that compassion could heal divisions that rules and policies never could. When she told him about it, he smiled and said, "Guess we started something bigger than us." Still, she had moments of doubt, memories of how cruel people could be. One night, she confessed, "Sometimes I wonder if it was worth all that pain." He looked at her and said, "If love doesn't test you, it doesn't change you." Those words stayed with her for a long time, because deep down, she knew he was right. Every battle they'd fought had shaped something unbreakable inside them. Months later, the school held an awards ceremony for educators who had made a difference in their community. Her name was called. The applause wasn't deafening, but it was genuine. She stood on that stage, looking out at her students, her colleagues, and in the back of the room, the man she had risked everything for. In that moment, it wasn't pride she felt. It was gratitude. Gratitude for every tear, every doubt, every second they refused to give up. And when she stepped off the stage, he was waiting for her by the door. He handed her a single white rose, its stem wrapped in an old strip of leather from his riding days. "A reminder," he said, "that beauty and strength can come from the same place." She held the rose close, her eyes glistening. And for the first time, she realized, what they had wasn't just love. It was legacy. Spring returned, soft and full of light, and with it came new beginnings. The town that had once turned its back on them now treated them with quiet respect. Time had softened opinions, and the people who once whispered about the teacher and the biker now saw something different. Two souls who never gave up on each other, no matter how hard the world tried to break them apart. They had become a living story, a reminder that love doesn't always follow the rules, but it always finds its way. He spent more time at the school now, helping maintain the garden out back. The students adored him, the man with oil-stained hands and a heart bigger than his rough exterior suggested. They'd ask about his motorcycle days, and he'd tell stories full of humor, never hiding the mistakes that had shaped him. "Every wrong turn taught me something," he'd say, "even the ones that hurt." The students listened, spellbound, not because he was a hero, but because he was real. One afternoon, she walked out to find him fixing the fence while the students helped. The sight made her heart ache with quiet pride. The man she had loved in secret was now a part of the community that once rejected him. "You've changed this place," she said softly. He smiled, brushing the dust from his hands. "No," he replied, "we changed it together." And it was true. Their love had not only survived, it had transformed everything around it. But as life often does, it tested them again. News came that one of her students, a boy she deeply cared for, was on the verge of dropping out. His father had been arrested, and the world had turned its back on him. She went to see him, but the boy wouldn't talk. So, he, her husband, her fighter, decided to step in. He took the boy to his shop, handed him a wrench, and said, "Fix something. Doesn't matter what. Just fix it." Hours passed before the boy finally spoke. And what he said broke them both. People say once you mess up, you stay messed up. That night, she held her husband tightly and whispered, "You showed him something no one ever showed you." He looked at her, eyes full of emotion. "Yeah," he said quietly, "that you can fall and still stand again." Summer came with laughter, warmth, and peace. Their home had become a sanctuary, not just for them, but for others. Former students, young mechanics, even strangers who needed a meal or advice. They all found their way to the little house by the edge of town. It wasn't just love that lived there anymore. It was kindness, multiplied and shared. She continued to teach, but now her lessons carried something more, a quiet depth that came from experience. When her students asked about love, she told them, "It's not about who the world approves of. It's about who makes you want to be better." They listened with wide eyes, unaware that the story she spoke of was her own. Sometimes, between lessons, she'd look out the window and see him walking toward the gate, his leather jacket faded, his hand steady, his smile the same one that had changed her life. Their story had stopped being a scandal long ago. Now, it was a testament. The community that once condemned them had started a local festival honoring voices of change, and she was invited to speak. Standing on that stage, with the crowd before her and the man she loved watching from the back, she said, "We all have pasts. Some are louder than others. But what matters is not where we came from. It's what we choose to build when the world stops believing in us. The audience rose to their feet in applause. That night, as they drove home under a sky painted in gold, he reached for her hand. "Funny how everything started with them trying to tear us apart," he said with a small grin. She leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "Maybe that's how love proves it's real, by surviving the storm." As they pulled into their driveway, the porch light glowed softly, the sound of crickets filling the night. For a long moment, they sat there in silence, the air thick with gratitude. Then, she said the words she always came back to, the ones that had carried them through every trial. "We didn't just find love," she whispered. "We built it." And in the quiet of that summer night, surrounded by everything they had fought for, he smiled and said, "And we'll keep building it, every day." Autumn arrived with crisp air and golden leaves, signaling another chapter in their lives. Their love had settled into a rhythm neither expected, a quiet, resilient harmony that spoke louder than any approval or judgment. He continued mentoring young people, sharing not just skills with bikes and mechanics, but lessons in integrity, resilience, and self-respect. She taught with renewed passion, her experience shaping lessons that went beyond textbooks, lessons of courage, empathy, and the transformative power of love. One afternoon, a student approached her nervously, clutching a notebook. "Ms. Thompson," he said, "I wanted to thank you for everything." She smiled gently. "You don't need to thank me, honey. You're the one who did the work." But he shook his head. "No, you taught me to see people, not just their mistakes or their past. And I'm trying to do better." She felt a lump in her throat. This was the ripple effect of a love that had been tested, scorned, and ultimately proven stronger than fear. Meanwhile, he watched from the doorway, hands resting on the old wooden frame, as she talked quietly with the student. He knew every word she said carried the weight of their journey, of all the storms they had weathered together. And when the boy left, she turned to him with a smile, one that said everything words could not. They had built something enduring. More than love, it was a legacy. Even the town began to notice. The gossip faded as the community witnessed the tangible impact of their partnership. Former skeptics approached them at school events, quietly acknowledging the strength it took to endure public scrutiny and still act with grace. Slowly, admiration replaced suspicion, and the couple realized that their story had become a beacon for others, proof that authenticity and courage could rewrite the narrative of a life once defined by judgment. As the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, they sat together on the porch, watching the world move at its usual pace. They didn't speak much, because they didn't need to. The quiet between them was comfortable, a reflection of all they had survived. And in that silence, they both knew one unshakable truth. Nothing could dismantle what had been forged through trust, resilience, and unwavering love. Winter approached, bringing a sense of reflection and closure. Their lives, once disrupted by rumor and fear, had settled into purpose and fulfillment. Every action they took, whether teaching a lesson, mentoring a youth, or simply showing kindness, carried the weight of their story. It had become a living example that love can thrive even in environments designed to break it. One evening, they hosted a small gathering at their home. Former students, colleagues, and neighbors came together, not to celebrate them as individuals, but to honor the lessons they had modeled. He stood beside her, quietly proud, watching as people shared their stories of change and growth inspired by what they had seen. The room was warm, filled with gratitude and the subtle recognition that love, when genuine, multiplies beyond those who experience it directly. After the guests left, they walked together to the edge of the yard, where the last leaves of autumn rustled under their feet. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked, her voice soft. He smiled, slipping his hand into hers. "Every day," he said, "and I think about all the people we've touched along the way. That's the part that matters most." She leaned against him, feeling the weight of the journey behind them and the promise of every day ahead. They had endured judgment, fear, and whispers meant to break them, but they had survived stronger than ever. Their love had become more than a bond between two people. It had become a testament to resilience, empathy, and the courage to stand for what the heart knows is right, even when the world doesn't understand. As the first snowflakes began to fall, they stood silently, holding each other close, and understood that their story was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to every person who had ever faced doubt, fear, or scorn for loving fully. It was proof that when hearts are brave and unwavering, even the harshest storms can be weathered, and love, real love, will always find a way to endure. In the end, their story was never about scandal. It was about courage, resilience, and the transformative power of love. A teacher and a former biker, two worlds that should have clashed, instead collided to create something stronger than fear, stronger than judgment. Their journey reminds us that true connection doesn't seek approval. It withstands scrutiny and grows in the face of adversity. Sometimes, the hardest battles are fought not in public, but in the quiet decisions we make to stand by those we love. Through every whisper, every judgment, and every challenge, they discovered a truth too few realize. Love, when rooted in honesty and mutual respect, can become a force that heals, uplifts, and inspires. It transforms not just the lives of those who share it, but everyone who witnesses it. Their relationship became a beacon for anyone who has ever been misunderstood, judged, or doubted, proof that authenticity and courage can rewrite even the harshest narratives. Their example teaches us that standing up for what the heart knows is right requires bravery. It means risking disapproval, facing fear, and choosing integrity over comfort. It is not easy, and it is not always accepted, but it is always worth it. In their story, we see that love is not measured by the absence of obstacles, but by the willingness to overcome them together. And perhaps the most powerful lesson of all is this: the world will never stop questioning, judging, or trying to define what is acceptable. But the measure of a life well lived is not in others' approval. It is in the courage to act with compassion, the strength to remain loyal to your truth, and the persistence to nurture the relationships that matter most. Their love endured because it was intentional, patient, and unwavering. If this story inspired you, let it stay with you beyond this video. Share your thoughts in the comments, letting us know how love and courage have shaped your life. Like the video if you believe in the power of standing up for what you feel is right, and subscribe to the channel to discover more stories that remind us all that resilience, empathy, and authentic connection can change lives, and sometimes, even the world.